You think you know Henry VIII, the larger-than-life King of England, the one with 6 wives and a temper that could end a life with a single word. The man painted in those famous portraits, glaring out from under his broad hat, jewels glittering on his chest, a hand resting proudly on his sword. But those paintings lie to you. They show the mask Henry wanted the world to see. Powerful, unshakable, unchallenged. What they don't show is the horror behind the mask, the stench of his body, the cruelty of his mind, and the fear that spread like a poison through every corner of his kingdom. Henry's story begins in golden light. He was never meant to be king, born the spare heir, a boy destined for the church while his older brother, Arthur, carried the crown in waiting. But fate shifted. Arthur died young, and suddenly this athletic, charismatic prince was next in line. People adored him. He had the looks, the charm, the strength. He jousted with reckless skill, hunted with boundless energy, danced and played music like a prince in a storybook. To his subjects, he was everything a young king should be: handsome, generous, radiant with promise. But the promise curdled, slowly, then all at once. Henry VIII transformed from golden prince into grotesque tyrant. And it wasn't just his politics that turned dark, it was his very body, betraying him in ways that mirrored the corruption of his reign. He grew obese, monstrously so. His once athletic frame collapsed under the weight of excess, swollen with disease and gluttony. His legs developed ulcers that oozed pus, the stench so overpowering that servants gagged when they entered his chambers. They dressed the wounds with poultices and herbs, but nothing stopped the smell. The king himself reeked of death while still alive, and yet no one dared flinch, no one dared complain. To show disgust was to risk execution, so they bowed low, forced smiles, and swallowed the bile in their throats. His appetites matched his size. Meals stretched for hours, courses upon courses of meat, pies, sweet wines, sugared fruits. He consumed like a man afraid of emptiness, as if he could fill the hollowness of his soul with roasted capons and spiced venison. His paranoia, too, was ravenous. Friends, advisors, wives, no one was safe when suspicion gripped him. At the height of his reign, the air around him grew heavy with terror. Men whispered cautiously, choosing every word with care. For a careless joke or a doubtful glance could be branded treason, and treason ended not with exile, but with the axe. Perhaps nothing reveals Henry's horror more than his marriages. 6 women, each dragged into his orbit by politics, ambition, or fear. Catherine of Aragon, his brother's widow, whom he married in his youth and stayed with for decades, before discarding her when she could no longer bear him sons. Anne Boleyn, fiery and clever, who captured his obsession but lost her head when she failed to deliver a male heir. Jane Seymour, who gave him the son he craved, but died in childbirth, leaving him oddly both grief-stricken and satisfied. Anne of Cleves, dismissed with insults because he found her unattractive. Catherine Howard, barely a teenager, executed after rumors of infidelity. And finally, Catherine Parr, who outlived him only by managing the impossible, appeasing the tyrant without becoming his victim. Each queen tells a story of fear, manipulation, and danger. Anne Boleyn, once the most powerful woman in England, ended her life kneeling on the scaffold, accused of crimes most historians now see as fabrications. Her brother, her friends, dragged down with her, their blood spilled to soothe Henry's wounded pride. Catherine Howard, young and naive, begged for mercy when her execution day came. But mercy was not in Henry's vocabulary. His need for control was absolute, his ego fragile enough that even imagined slights ended in death. And yet, while he destroyed those closest to him, his own body became its own cruel executioner. The fall from his horse in 1536 changed everything. He had been jousting, armored and proud, when the horse toppled and crushed him. He was unconscious for 2 hours. When he woke, he was never the same. His leg injuries never healed. They festered, burst, infected. Doctors lanced them again and again, but the wounds roared back. Pain gnawed at him endlessly. He couldn't ride, couldn't run, couldn't dance as he once had. The king who had dazzled crowds with athleticism was trapped in a body that decayed while he watched. The bitterness that followed seeped into every decision. He lashed out at courtiers, lashed out at wives, lashed out at anyone unlucky enough to catch his eye on a bad day. By the last years of his reign, Henry VIII was a monster not just in reputation, but in flesh. Bloated to the point he required mechanical devices to hoist him from bed. Carried through halls that stank of infection. His body collapsing under its own weight. Courtiers described him as terrifying to behold. He was the king, yes, but also a shambling ruin. A reminder of mortality dressed in velvet and gold. And still, no one dared speak the truth. The king's word was law, and his fury was swift. When death finally came in 1547, it brought no dignity. His body, already bloated and rotting, was sealed in a coffin that could not contain him. Gases built up, the corpse swelling grotesquely until the coffin cracked. Fluid seeped out onto the church floor, and legend has it that dogs licked the royal remains. For a man who had demanded reverence his entire life, the ending was poetic in its horror, nature itself mocking his decay. This is the true Henry VIII, not the stern but majestic king of portraits, not the tragic figure remembered in nursery rhymes, but a man who embodied horror in both his rule and his body, a king whose appetites devoured not only food but people, whose paranoia destroyed families, toppled friendships, and left England scarred, and whose final days, spent in pain, stench, and decay, mirrored the reign of terror he inflicted on his kingdom. When we remember him, we should remember the fear in his wife's eyes, the silence in his court, the smell that followed him down the halls, and the sound of his coffin splitting as it could no longer hold, the weight of his corruption. That is why Henry VIII was not just a king of England, but perhaps the most horrifying king in history. Henry VIII's later years were the most grotesque chapter of his life. By this point, he was not the charming young prince anymore. He was a man falling apart, and everyone in his court could see it. His once broad shoulders had sagged into folds of fat. His arms were thick but useless, and his famous legs, once his pride as a horseman, were now diseased. His doctors could do little but poke and prod at the open. Sores that constantly leaked pus. The smell was unbearable. Servants would gag as they tried to dress him, and sometimes they fainted. But none dared complain. This was the king, after all. One wrong word, and they could end up with their head on the block. Henry's paranoia only grew as his health declined. He had always been quick to anger, but now his moods swung wildly. He could smile one moment and demand an execution the next. Anyone who disagreed with him, anyone who hesitated, anyone who simply looked the wrong way could be accused of treason. Treason was a flexible charge, it didn't need proof. It only needed Henry's suspicion, and so the court lived in fear. Nobles who had once been Henry's closest companions were suddenly dragged away. His old friend Thomas More had been executed years earlier for refusing to recognize Henry's supremacy over the church. Now more and more followed. Even Henry's wives were not safe. Catherine Howard, the young teenage bride, was sent to her death after rumors of her affairs. She was barely more than a child when she was executed at the Tower of London. By this point, Henry had married 6 times, each marriage ending in either annulment, death, or misery. He was a man who consumed wives like he consumed food, greedily, carelessly, leaving wreckage behind. But perhaps the most horrifying part of Henry's story is his body itself. Imagine a king so obese that special devices had to be constructed just to lift him in and out of bed. Imagine a monarch whose coffin could not contain the gases of his rotting corpse, so that when he finally died, his body exploded and seeped into the church floor. That is not myth, that is history. When Henry VIII's bloated body was laid to rest in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, the coffin leaked fluids, and local legend says dogs came to lick at the mess. A king reduced to a spectacle of decay, even in death. And yet, despite all of this, despite the terror, the executions, the failed marriages, the rotting flesh, Henry VIII remains one of the most famous kings in English history. His reign changed England forever. He tore the country away from the Catholic Church. He established the foundations of the Church of England. And he left behind a dynasty that shaped the nation for generations. But the cost of this transformation was steep. Thousands of lives were destroyed, entire families ruined, and a kingdom ruled by fear. So why call him the most horrifying king in history? Because he embodied horror not just in his actions, but in his very existence. His life was a study in contrasts. The golden prince turned monstrous tyrant, the lover turned executioner, The handsome athlete turned rotting invalid. His court was a place where beauty and terror lived side by side, where music and dancing could give way to executions, where laughter could be silenced by the swing of an axe. Henry VIII reminds us that power without limits corrupts not just the soul, but the body. He devoured everything: power, wealth, women, food, until there was nothing left but decay. His reign is a warning written in flesh and blood. And so when we remember Henry, we should remember the full story, not just the rhyme about divorced, beheaded, died, but the truth of a man whose very body became a symbol of his corruption.